Is it worth it? Is perhaps the single most important question in watchmaking and watch collecting, and it's also one of the hardest to answer. Let me explain. There have always been luxury watches, and at the beginning of the history of watchmaking, some 500 years ago, watches were not practical timekeepers. Generally, they ran for less than 24 hours, and they were often off by an hour or more a day. They were so expensive that only the very wealthy could afford them. The movements were so difficult to make that they were often worth more than the gold and jeweled cases. Now, gradually, watches became more and more precise, and by the time Breguet opened his workshop, real precision watchmaking was possible. By the 19th century, the first large-scale industrial watch factories had been established, precision kept going up, and prices kept coming down. Eventually, watches and clocks, albeit of varying quality, became available to almost everyone, and by the end of World War II, it was possible to buy reasonably precise watches from dozens of manufacturers that were relatively affordable. Now that said, there were still enormous variations in quality, and there was a general understanding about what constituted fine watchmaking. Generally speaking, a high-quality watch would have the following characteristics. First, it would have better materials, harder steel for pivots, for example. Secondly, there would be better precision in construction, which means not only better accuracy, but also less wear. Often, high-quality watches would have a higher jewel count, especially on critical working surfaces. And finally, high-quality watches had better finishing of components. Now, this was partly decorative, but it was also partly done in order to reduce wear and tear and corrosion. Take black polished steel, for instance. Black polished steel parts, as well as blued steel parts, simply resist corrosion better. Supplied movements were widely used, and making a movement in-house, or being a completely vertically integrated manufacturer, it was not considered indispensable in a quality watch, and many of the top watchmaking houses used movements provided by suppliers. Now, mechanical watches up until the quartz crisis could be luxuries, but they were also necessities. Post-quartz crisis, marine chronometer precision was available very, very cheaply, and today atomic clock level precision is available to anyone with a cell phone. Mechanical watchmaking is now, in kind of a funny way, exactly where it was 500 years ago. No longer a necessity, mechanical watches are now worn for reasons of personal taste, nostalgia, and by those who love the art and science of watchmaking for its own sake. That said, the same basic rules for quality still apply. However, finishing has become, over the last half-decade, something that more and more watch enthusiasts care about. Some of the most famous independent watchmakers are famous primarily for the level of finishing in their movements. This includes Recep Recep, George Daniels, and Roger Smith. Finishing, however, is very hard to evaluate, and for several reasons. First of all, hand finishing can to some degree be simulated or imitated with increasing accuracy by automation or semi-automated techniques. Secondly, hand finishing styles vary. One notable example is in Roger Smith's watches, which are finished in a style much more associated with British than with French or Swiss watchmaking. Hand finishing on watch parts not visible through a displayback may or may not be consistent with what is visible through a displayback. This is a phenomenon known as displayback finishing. And of course, what collectors always hope is that the parts you can't see are as finished as well as the parts you can see. There's a general misunderstanding about the amount of hand finishing that goes into luxury watches. There may be a considerable amount of human labor involved, especially in quality control, but a truly hand-finished watch movement is a relative rarity today. There are several things that can affect the perception of whether or not a watch is worth it. Perceived quality is one, which to a large extent still has to do with fine finishing. Historical importance is another. Classic design, like the Calatrava, the Cartier Tank, the Royal Oak and Nautilus, and many other designs which have stood the test of time and can affect perception of the value of a watch. The history of the use of a watch by professionals can affect the perceived value of a watch. Dive watches being actually used by divers, for instance, pilots' watches being used by pilots. And this includes, of course, the Omega Speedmaster Professional, which was used in crewed spaceflight. Then there's perceived prestige value, or social status signaling. Now, This is easy for some purists to look down on, but the truth is, it's an important part of why people buy luxury watches, and it's an important part of what makes wearing one fun. This is perhaps the most complex part of the equation because what's prestigious in one context may seem mundane in another. Investment value can be very important, although again, the degree to which a watch is worth it as an investment is very variable over time. For many of us, at the very least, we hope that a watch will keep its value. Finally, unusual and interesting design, whether classic or innovative, commands attention and will often command higher prices as well. The worth of a watch is still partly due to its perceived value as a timekeeper, but with the ubiquity of atomic clock-level precision timekeeping, this has become much less important. Price, therefore, has become increasingly detached from precision. This has left watchmakers free, however, to experiment, and the level of creativity over the last 20 years in fine watchmaking and clockmaking has become very high. The ubiquity of precision timekeeping has also created the expectation among enthusiasts that precision should be a given, and that while a highly precise chronometer-grade watch may not be perceived as the added value it once was, it's still in the background as the most fundamental part of what you might call the social contract between an owner and their wristwatch. Finally, I think of the old joke about Ferraris. If you want one and you can afford it, the question isn't, is it worth it? The question is, what color?